I think that the active introduction will be done by the talk itself. So the title of the presentation is Post-Clock Rationalizations, and that in itself is a play on words. I hope you don't mind a few linguistic slips here and there. Is intimately concerned with the notion of time, its measurement, its manipulation, and ultimately its synthesis, its creation. So just going to give you a quick drive-by of a few recent texts that I've written, which we're drawing upon in this exploration. So I'm the editor at a journal at the MIT Media Lab called the Computational Law Report. And that to me is extremely funny because I have absolutely no experience of the law. But I guess the reason I'm there is we're looking at the way that leaderless technological systems, how they govern themselves, how they evolve themselves, how they regulate themselves. And that seems to show one of the paths forward for organizing with technology and the way that the laws of nations might interact with that or otherwise. And right on the screen, there's a Pepe beam. I know we're at the nexus of the East and West here, so I will just say that in the West, Pepe, the frog, is much maligned. But as we know, in other lands, that character has been reclaimed, not least in Hong Kong, when it was used as a symbol of freedom against the imperial ambitions of Hong Kong's mighty neighbor. So at this stage of the presentation, I implore you to decolonize your notions of Pepe. Here's an article I wrote for Spike Art magazine in the midst of the NFT mania in the pandemic. And this was quite a strident piece of criticism called "The Revolution Will Not Be Tokenized." And like the TLDR here was that at that time, people saw the potential for a new paradigm to be evolving and being manifested. But the point I was trying to make here is that really the logics that we saw NFTs as they're applied to the art world were just replicating the existing structures and logics of scarcity, of speculation. And as a result, the only revolution that was happening here is the revolution you get in a revolving door when you end up back in the same place that you started. Here's an article I wrote for like a philosophical art project concerned with time called Temporal Secessionism. And this article was called Reminiscences of a Clock Operator. We'll go into some of that. On the social cult, or like, let's say, extreme strains of social cults that seem to be forming around technology communities. This article was called Necroprimitivism Rising. It's specifically concerned with the cult of Bitcoin and its monstrously thirsty energy consuming mode of operation. And at the start of the year, the 20-year anniversary of one of the most important texts from the University of Warwick CCRU research group was published as a book. This was Anna Greenspan's PhD thesis, Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine. And with some colleagues, I wrote the foreword to that, trying to recontextualize it for the present day. And yeah, most recently, there was an essay called Profit Motives Knightwork States, which is attempting to draw parallels between some of the more controversial events of medieval history and the neo-colonial desires we see of the technology brotherhood in the present moment. So we're going to get to all of that in a minute. And just to say something about the Zero X Salon, which is a collective that started in Berlin a few years ago at the workspace called Trust. It's pretty much an event series that attempts to explore weird topics in digital culture through like a post-disciplinary lens. So we try to bring people together from diverse backgrounds and work through some of the pain points we see in as technology meets society. And one of the ways we do that is we hold these behind closed doors, like curated invitation events that we call salons. And then we do them under Chatham House rules, which means that in the room we can say what we want without worrying about those statements being used out of context. Because outside the room, Chatham House rule necessitates that we can, restricts us to be able to say what was said, who was there, but not who said what. And so as a result of that, we decided to start writing up some of the findings, or like some of the discussions that we had, to communicate those to the wider world. We'd have started making art, running a residency program, and yeah, other stuff. Here's some of the topics that we discuss. They go from, I guess, like weird theory stuff around epistemologies, abstractions, to tensions between ecology and nature, virus, memes, anarchy, new forms of colonization, and implications of technology, capital, and divinity, and everything in between. Okay, so here's the talk. First section is called Coordination Problem, and it is about capitalism. So here's a meme. Financial growth, exponential financial growth on a planet with finite resources. And the bottom right-hand corner, there's a screen clip from a computer game called Universal Paperclips. And in this game, you are a humble paperclip maker. You have strips of metal, and you need to make paperclips. And there's a little button that you click, and you click the button once, one strip of metal becomes one paperclip. And as you go through the game, you start getting tools, you can automate this process, you can scale it up. And it ends with the logical endpoint of where I see market-based capitalism driving towards, which is you're a hyperdimensional advanced AI stripping the universe of all the useful materials so you can make some more fucking paperclips. And that's kind of what capitalism, the market-based contemporary forms of capitalism we have today, seem to be doing. They're optimized to explore, exploit, and extract without much, let's say, scant regard for the consequences and the externalities of that if they're left unchecked. So when we have these this idea of networks, whether they're social, whether they're human, whether they're infrastructural, whether they're economic and communication networks, they're architected and structured in certain ways, either by accident or by design. And those differences in the ways that people can communicate or have access to resources leads to asymmetries. It leads to heterogeneities, unfairnesses, inequalities. I mean, we all know this. But when we have things like physical networks, communication networks, digital networks, these things can be somehow studied and mapped out and rendered rather more explicit. So this is like on the right, a little bit of work I was doing trying to use the stepped pyramids, the ziggurats, like Saqqara, to model the unfairnesses in peer-to-peer monetary networks, like cryptocurrencies. Oh, Baudrillard checkpoint. So before we go too much further, let's talk about symbolic exchange and death. So we live in a society, and the way that technology fuses, affects, and infiltrates it seems to have been presaged pretty well by Baudrillard. And we all know about this well-worn notion of the simulacrum, where the abstracted variants of the real surpass their predecessors. But in Symbolic Exchange and Death, some of his later work, he left this idea behind. He was looking more at this kind of through a semiotic lens, through like a purely symbolic approach. I'm going to read you a little quote. We now live in a world dominated by the free play of the monetary sign that is beyond reference to any real production or even a monetary referent in the form of a gold standard. In this world, the idea of a real value, of equities, of commodities, of houses, of anything, is meaningless. It's what matters instead. It's not value per se, but infinite speculation. This new world is marked by the emergence of a brothel of capital, not for prostitution, but for substitutions and commutation. So we're in a brothel right now. And Baudrillard sets out this three-stage taxonomy leading to where we are today, where we've gone from raw commodities, which have natural value, whether that's like sacks of wheat, bars of gold, the rest, pure natural resources, to refined ones that have had labor action on them to create social value. So whether that's wheat becoming bread, or whether it's coal becoming steel, and so on. But yeah, Baudrillard proposed that we were reaching a point, and I would say that we are definitely in this point by now, where we're now seeing symbolic forms of value surpassing those of the commodity, the raw and refined commodities. And in this, I really see the post-social monetary science that Baudrillard was referring to as the meme economies we see today, whether that's things like GameStop, where kind of like the mob rule can, overturn the conceived wisdom of traditional markets, all the way through to, cryptocurrencies are a particularly grotesque example of this, We have like Dogecoin, or we have random weird kind of Islamic branded scam coins in Turkey. So people are using symbols to try and create this mimetic stickiness and to build markets and extract value from these memes, from these concepts. I'd put that there. Okay, yeah, so we're now going to go from capital towards time. So one of the things I've been trying to do is draw an equivalence between capital and some other, let's say, important things in the universe that we live in. So I'm going to read out two quotes on the screen. First one is from Anna Greenspan's Ph.D. thesis, Capitalism's Transcendental Time Machine, with the foreword to that we wrote last year. New conceptions of time can only be ever thought of in relation to emerging techno-capitalist apparatuses, which themselves generate time. And it is distribution, ordering, and arbitration of time that these apparatuses control. Capitalist time is ultimately born of strict equivalence with capital. In essence, time equals money. And this idea of time equals money is not very hard for us to apprehend. Many of us work by the hour, or we have a salary. We work by the month or by the year. And this equivalence between time and money is something that capital and technology, they go hand in glove to push and to motivate the creation of ever more precise ways to manage, measure, and manipulate the flows of time. And on the other side, here's a quote from a book that's coming out next year that I'm in the middle of writing. Weltentzauberung, the notion of disenchantment of the world via Weber and Schiller, anticipates the exfiltration of magic, sorcery, and the occult from the arena of divinity by upstart belief systems. In their place, other cultural rationalizations appear. Has the marketplace of ideology dethroned God with the demi-urgent efficiencies of precisely measured, regulated, and quantized time? And here, we could draw an analog between time and God. So I'm looking for ways to interrelate capital, God, and time. And these are just two of the statements that we're using in place of axioms as we try to do this theoretical reasoning. So some might say, welcome to the Renaissance. Now, what's that word? I've never heard it before. It's a made-up word. It's like metaverse. We've combined the Latin and Greek words, the root of chronos, the Greek from time, and naissance, Latin for the renewal. So this is about the creation of new temporal regimes. Here's a meme, or even a matrix. This is from the corporate surrealist vibe shift by Reality Spanner. And we're comparing different forms of, or perspectives as to the reality of time and money. So there's a good old Hillary Clinton in the top left. She thinks that money is real and time is real. Immanuel Kant thinks that money is real but time is not real. And that's to do with the transcendental move that Kant did, that indeed the Greenspan built on later. You could argue that Deleuze is an anti-realist in this case, because money is not real but time is real. And we've got Kanye in the bottom corner, who thinks that money ain't real and time ain't real. And I think Kanye's there because a big part of this, the article that this came from, was talking about the weird moves that Kanye keeps doing, where he keeps saying something unconscionable and burning his business empire, and then coming back in this incredibly convoluted and theatrical way, which is not how you're supposed to do capitalism, right? You're supposed to just accumulate stuff. But yeah, so that's the surrealism. But if we take this concept of the Renaissance, especially the way that Greenspan conceived of it, we can then do a little bit of overlaying here. So I see this Renaissance that technology is distantiating as moving from the Kantian idea, where the transcendental move first creates an inside and an outside, and we have this kind of bifurcation between the eternal logics of precisely measured time and the subjective, more Bergsonian experience of time happening, through to a Deleuzian, or like a post-Bergsonian Deleuzian idea, where we take that transcendental outside, we flatten it into an immanent plane of intensities and multiplicities, which Greenspan calls aeon rather than kairos. So when we have this map, we can also then put things that happen in the world on it. So the clock's just changed in most of the world, not in Turkey, but in most of the world. And here's a map of the daylight savings or the time zone changes in Australia. If you look at the center of the map, some parts of Australia think that time is real and some parts of Australia think that time is not real. So interesting to know. The way that humans conceive and depict the measurement of time, the flow of time, also changes, like has changed through history, depending on the technologies and the ways of seeing that we've had at our disposal. So these are old representations of temperance, the Christian virtue, patience, basically. And it's very often that you would see the oldest representations of temperance with two vessels of fluids, pouring them from one to the other. And it's that flow that is relatively constant. We can measure the passage of time by this flow. And indeed, the earliest clocks that we know about were water clocks in China, possibly up to 10,000 years ago. There are some very old clocks in the Museum of Islamic Art and Science. Here, very old clocks, by the way, if you don't know that, go check them out. And so as technology changed, or as the way we measure time changed, so did also the depictions of temperance. So here's temperance with an hourglass. And then in the 16th century, Heinrich Susso's The Wisdom of the Clock represented temperance with mechanical clocks. And so what I'm wondering now is, who will draw temperance with a laser clock or an atomic clock or a blockchain clock? I'm yet to see that. Here's a time machine that I used to operate. This is a screenshot of the Pirate ultrafast laser system in the UK, which I did my Ph.D. on. I did a Ph.D. on weird timing stuff with lasers. So it was funny to be writing the foreword to the well-known philosophy text on capitalism's transcendental time machine when I realized that many years ago I was a transcendental time machine operator. And the way that time machine works in its transcendental function is actually on this map, which is called a Jablonski diagram. So the arrows going up are the energy going into the system, and then the squiggly ones are the energies coming out of the system. And the rates of all these things happening give us an extremely precise way of measuring time. Okay, let's talk about how this abstract sense of time ends up being applied in our world. These technologies shape and are shaped by the production logics of capitalism, the clock, enabling autonomous timekeeping, synchronized industrial production, and transport systems, meanwhile acting both as an instrument and a symbol of power and authority. The introduction of global temporal standards such as Greenwich Mean Time, time zones, daylight saving time, and network-mediated machining temporalities all served to imbue timekeeping practices with greater precision and universality. That's coming back to time has power. You mentioned Greenwich Mean Time. The location of this kind of global time zone system was extremely contentious, by the way. A little known fact is that Paris refused to accept, the French refused to accept Greenwich Mean Time. And so Paris Mean Time was a thing for a little while. I think it was offset by a few minutes. So time is power, and whoever gets to set the time can use that as an instrument of control. And that goes all the way back to timekeeping systems inside early factories, where the clock would be controlled by the factory owners, by the purveyors of capital. They would set the time, and therefore they could manipulate the time to extract productivity from the workers unfairly. So those who control the means of temporal production also have a means with which to express power. And yes, there's been plenty of examples all around the world of colonial parties imposing their timekeeping logics on the oppressed local populations, not least Ireland, Palestine. India is a great example as well with the railway time. Where's the biggest clock tower in the world? That's it there. It's in Mecca, which I think is very, very interesting. So these gigantic phalluses that we build to commemorate the universality of particular timekeeping systems, I mean, you know, they're like every other giant phallus in the sky. It's a representation of power, of domination over the subjects and the land, and over the ideologies that exist underneath them. Oh, Y2K checkpoint. So it's a little bit of a while ago, but I guess some of you still remember the year 2000, and maybe even the years before that. There was a real panic that everything was going to fail. Like all of our computer systems, which have been running since the middle of the 20th century, only had enough address space to keep 2 digits of the year. So when we got to 1999, obviously the year increments up by 1 in these systems repeatedly. When we get to 99, it can't go up to 100 because we've only got 2 digits to work with. And so the theory was that planes would fall out of the sky, nuclear weapons would get launched, and we would literally see a doomsday moment. There was a eschatological fear around this being the end times for many people. But it seems like nothing happened, right? Some people think, though, that something did happen, but it was more subtle than the planes falling out of the sky and us dying in a nuclear holocaust. Rather, the theories that Greenspan and co put forwards are that around the turn of the millennium heralded a new supremacy of machine time over the time of the calendar and the clock, our traditional, pre-digital forms of timekeeping. And so where I see things like Y2K and other ways that we use digital technology to represent this infinite concept of time, is that these are finite representatives of the ineffable. We're trying to capture something unbounded and put it into digital address space, and we keep fucking it up. So, within the moment of Y2K, there was present an understanding that the machinery of networks and digital computation facilitates new potentials for universalities and totalities. All of the techno-economic affordances of virtual capital flows are rendered achievable through the proliferation of chronometers for cyberspace in the ascendant since Y2K. Digital timekeeping at scale began in earnest at the dawn of the 1970s with the creation ex nihilo of Unix time. And so I'll just say very briefly something about Unix time, because it's extremely important in the computer systems we have today. So a little bit like the Y2K, 2-digit representation of the year, Unix time is a 32-bit integer which started at 0, 32 zeros, on the 1st of January 1970. And every second it goes up by 1. So it's just a dumb counter of the number of seconds. So again, we're using digital technology in its finitude to try and represent this ineffable, infinite concept of time. And because of that, we're going to run out of time. The Unix clock is also going to run out. And that is the next Y2K, which happens in 2038. So you'll start hearing about that soon, commonly. We call it the epocalypse. And so most digital systems are going to need, again, like some attention to see if there's going to be failure modes in that. And some people are already saying this is going to be the end of the world. What I would say is we should probably stop using clocks as computers. But now there's another way we can keep the time. And there's a new technological scaffold which enables us to do that without any reliance on the calendar, or on the clock, or on the year. So all these problems that beset Y2K and Unix time, or like the 2038 problem that's represented by Unix time, don't exist in this new temporal paradigm. And that new temporal paradigm is called blockchain technology, made famous by Bitcoin and Ethereum and stuff like that. And I'm not going to talk about like tokens and getting rich. We're just going to talk about the clock, the internal chronometers in these systems, because they're very interesting from a theoretical perspective. If we're trying to understand how time might be measured, might be created. You might even say that blockchains are time machines. Great display. So this is a visual representation of the Bitcoin clock. Every 600 seconds on average, a new page of this eternal ledger that the decentralized cryptocurrency network Bitcoin manifests is appended to this uncorruptible record of the history of the network, which chronicles the order in which a series of events on the network happened. These are transactions in this particular case. And what's interesting about this is not taking a cue from the sun or from the moon or from the stars. This is its own stochastic clock. So it's a random process that finds these blocks and adds them to this the ledger. And that process is called the Bitcoin mining, which you might have heard of. And so Bitcoin is a clock with its own logics. and it doesn't depend on much outside of it, apart from the people that are doing this mining, doing these cycles of computation, in order to find these blocks and add them to the chain. And so Bitcoin is regulating how likely it is each of these pieces of computation, these proofs of work, these Bitcoin mining cycles, lead to the minting of a new block. And it is through that process, through this creation of this decentralized block, that is, in my opinion, both the best and the worst thing about Bitcoin. This decentralized clock is really cool, but I guess we'll get to the other part a bit later. All right. So one thing I want to remind you of is that, as we saw with these kind of colonial examples, even in a post-digital world, or in a digital and a post-digital world, people that control the time, that create the time, that measure the time, that impose the time, they gain power just from that privilege. So one speculation seems uncontroversial: the capital and those entities in the service of it will continue to desire, enact, and exploit ever grander conceptions and architectures of temporal engineering. For as long as there's value to be redistributed, there will be incentives to engineer more sophisticated machinery with which to manipulate the nature and the flow of time. All right. I thought we'll take a little pause here, and I'll read you out a literary refraction based loosely on the theories of Greenspan. So this is a poem written by a poetic subgroup of the Zero Exelon called the Cryptographic Poetics Researchers Union, the CPRU. I wonder how they thought of that maybe. And I'll just read you a little bit of it. Object-oriented Scientology, framing the problem so well, it creates the anti-solution, a self-fulfilling prophecy, tautological fallacy. All that is squalid melts into air. Abandon code, all ye who enter here. Delphine autopepsia, the grey goo glue that binds piers in the valleys, becomes concrete handcuffs in the desert. Agent provocognateur, calculating, implicating, imbricating, the body without organs, and yet striated space, an amorphous oracle, sensing network fates. So, mostly a critique there, I would say. I want to then move now into a related thick research theme, research topic, which I think of most generally as an investigation into the ideologies of scarcity, or the ideologies that orbit and arise from scarcity. And I've subtitled it Sleepwalking into Oblivion. You'll see why. So, the church and the network, zeal and time, death and money, all sides the same coin. So we talked about Bitcoin earlier, and how great a clock it is. Well, guess what? There's a problem. You've already heard about it. As a consequence of this regulative mechanism, which keeps the small hand of Bitcoin's clock ticking, in an energetic sense, Bitcoin is insatiable. It will never have enough energy. If you give it more energy, the blocks come faster, and this regulative system slows that down by making the probability of success of each attempt to find a block lower. You could think of it like a lottery. If people make more tickets, the probability of success is reduced. And the problem with that is then there's no upper limit to the amount of energy that Bitcoin desires. And not only that, it is largely insensate. So not only does it not care about its externalities, it cannot care, does not have sensory capabilities. All it wants is the energy to keep itself running. And so I've got this slightly crass meme to write, which says, I have to be the highest maintenance clock in the universe for some reason. And that's how we see Bitcoin. So yeah, here's the biographical part of the talk. I found Bitcoin 10 years ago. I really liked it. I come from a diaspora background. My family's from Iraq. They had a lot of political problems under Saddam Hussein. And when they left, they had to leave with nothing in a big hurry. And my folks moved to England shortly before I was born. And I lived there most of my life. So when I found this thing, I was like, wow, it's the money that the bad people can't take away from you. That's cool. And you can't kill it. It's like a cockroach. And so as a research project, it seems very interesting. Unfortunately, this desire for energy, the cost that we pay to keep the decentralized network of Bitcoin running, increases at this enormous pace. It's the fastest growing energy demand source on the planet. And so at some point, all the benefits that you see from having a natively digital, uncensual and unseizable way of transferring value, borderlessly protecting you from inflation and so on, it comes at this cost, this massive environmental energetic cost. Now we live, just to recap, it's 2023, we live on a ball of rock and water next to a ball of light. We get all our energy from this ball of light, directly or indirectly, and we have a limited amount of it. So if there's a thing on this planet that we live on that wants all the energy it can get, we also need some. You can see why there might be eventually a problem in that calculus. We are still in a domain of scarcity right now. And so I'm sure you've heard, much ink has been spilled and much hot air has been distributed about the energetic costs of Bitcoin. The latest ideas seem to be that the climate impact of Bitcoin mining, this like a data center level of energetically intensive computations happening all around the world, is arguably greater than gold mining now. You know gold mining, where we dig holes in the ground, pumping full of chemicals to get shiny rocks out. It's worse than that. So the only thing that's really left is cattle farming. So now, instead of Bitcoin aspiring to be digital gold, it may aspire to be digital beef. And there's something interesting in this homology between Bitcoin, gold, and beef, because they appear to be central parts in the imaginary of the Bitcoiner, of the faithful people that believe in Bitcoin as a way to wash away the impurities of the central banking system of fiat currencies and so on. But there is a cost, massive cost. The other thing is the kinds of people that like Bitcoin, they're very right-wing. And that is something very interesting. If you log onto Twitter and do some searches for Bitcoin, you will find this out very quickly. And on the right, I find this very interesting. There's a lot of people in the Bitcoin space that like the mining so much that they think if we have more coal in the atmosphere, if we burn more coal, there'll be more CO2 in the atmosphere, we'll get more trees. So that's what they want. So what's happening? And here's a concept which I think might be quite helpful to rationalize some of this. It's called petromasculinity. And so I'm going to read a quote from Kara Daggett. As the planet warms, new authoritarian movements in the West are embracing a toxic combination of climate denial, racism, and misogyny. Petromasculinity appreciates the historic role of fossil fuel systems in buttressing white patriarchal rule, as anxieties aroused by the Anthropocene augment desires for authoritarianism. Petromasculinity suggests that fossil fuels mean more than profit. They contribute to making identities. Through a psychopolitical reading of authoritarianism, fossil fuel can function as a violent reactionary practice. All right. Here's a petromasculinist. This guy says he mined Bitcoin with Satoshi, the founder of Bitcoin, back in 2009 even. And the hard drive where which he could access his coins through the passwords which were stored on it, went in the bin and then to the municipal dump, to the trash heap. So he's spent the last 8 years trying to negotiate with the municipal council in the poorest parts of Britain to dig up the rubbish dump to try and find his hard drive. And I don't think he cares about the ecological disaster that this is going to create. He just wants to find his coins. So this is a particularly interesting example of how one's personal incentives might corrupt one's regard for the environment and the circumstances that we live in. Here's a poster from a Bitcoin conference in 2019. And I see Bitcoin as the most petro-masculinist of all the cryptocurrencies because it's one of the only ones that still uses the proof of work, this energy-intensive way of finding decentralized consensus. And in this conference, which was in Malta, the last home of the Crusader Order, the Knights Hospitaller, they dressed themselves up as Crusaders, which I think is very interesting. I actually applied to speak at this conference many years ago when I was into Bitcoin. I'm really glad they declined me, otherwise I'd be showing you this slide and my face would be on it. And so we call this kind of anti-ecology, pro-capital ideology that we see emerging with Bitcoin, necroprimitivism. And one of the things that the Zero Excelon has done is start to prepare various kinds of like ancillary texts and art projects exploring this concept a bit further. And so here's a piece of scripture, like commandments, written from the perspective of Bitcoin to its faithful. Crimes against virginity. Oh, by the way, I don't believe or agree in this. I'm just reading it out. Okay. Crimes against virginity. There is no a priori nature. Nature is a construct. Nature must not be assumed to be benign, nor veridical. Nature is zero-sum. Nature is not fair. Nature brings pain and suffering. Nature's qualities must be judged, and its shortcomings should not go unpunished. Nature must compete with forces in the marketplace of ideology. Before nature, there was a pristine realm of ecstatic superposition, energetic and material forms peacefully coexisting without an observer. Nature shackles the transcendence of light with its verdant gaze. Nature is a planetary liability, degenerate bourgeois luxury, misery engine. Nature is death. If nature is unjust, destroy nature. Crony capitalism. Thou shalt have no other assets before me. Capital in code reigns supreme. The dual canon subordinates ecology and labor, as it is written in my blocks and prophesied in the memory pools. The conditions for monetary transcendence must be seeded in the individual imaginary. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's clocks. Homo Blockonomicus desires a transcendental time machine, a thermoeconomic calendar for our rituals. I am the only refuge from the observer's gaze, become time capsules aboard my monument. Once again, it's the wide belief, but it's a pointed critique. So based on a lot of this material, last year we got some funding from the European Commission's Start Repairing the Present program to make a series of artistic interventions around these topics, these ideologies of scarcity. So we made a theatre production, a play, and performed it in Denmark about proof of work, 100 years of possible past, presents, and possible futures under a regime dominated by Bitcoin. And that was called The Black Hole of Money. And you can watch a video of that on our website. We also made a computer game where you play through these possible futures, attempting to save the planet from this inhuman monetary system. And that is currently on exhibition at the Haus der Elektronisches Kunst in Basel, virtual exhibition. So you can play the game if you go to virtual.agk.ch, and that's on for a few more weeks. And I want to introduce to you a very important character in both the play and the game. Well, I'm sure many of us remember Clippy, the annoying Microsoft Office anthropomorphized paperclip. But what about an anthropomorphized Bitcoin mining machine called Hashi? Well, it's a key character in the play in the game. This is a virtual influencer from the future that we suppose may come into existence as time goes on, as our planet degrades, and as public opinion moves further and further away and against this energy-intensive process, the only purpose of which is to maintain this monetary network, which is really for the benefit of the few rather than the many. So if you are the people that want to keep this ecologically damaging thing going, you might invent a cute little mascot to go around and gaslight and psyop everybody. Well, that's what Hashi is. Hashi serves as a literal, a figurative projection of the mortidal economics of combustive capital. But it's very cute. So that's how we get it. So I want to move now to talk a bit more about where these notions of time, capital, and power might be going towards. Like, what are they going to be used for? Where is this all going? Where's it going to end up? So we're going to talk about wildcats, wild wests, forced profits, and new colonialisms. So inside networks like Bitcoin and Ethereum, there are no explicit rulers. That's the point of these things. They're meant to be horizontalized spaces without humans, explicit roles of authority. But guess what? People just showed up and put on crowns and laurels and fancy suits and called themselves CEOs, leaders, and gods of these things. And so there's this thing which seems to happen through history, this echo through history, where these notions of the divine, or at least the extra mundane, seem to get projected onto otherwise unthinking and unfeeling pieces of infrastructure, like, all the way back from cargo cults of the 20th century, through to what we see today. I thought I had another slide. There's somebody that's not on this slide, which is sometimes quite a nice thing to talk about, which is that there was a guy in Bitcoin a few years ago that just showed up and started calling himself Bitcoin Jesus. And then everyone started calling him Bitcoin Jesus. And then guess what? He became Bitcoin Judas. So it's very interesting to see the kinds of people that get attracted to, whether it's power or money or fame or some combination of those things, when there are no formal structures in place for humans to kind of settle into. From an anthropological perspective, is extremely interesting. So I wanted to read you a little excerpt from an upcoming book I'm writing about techno-colonialism, which is called Profit Motives. For as long as there's been financial capital, risk and speculation have orbited, manipulated, and harnessed it. As narrative feedback machines, simultaneously reading and rewriting realities, markets exist as a distributed conversation amongst speculators driven by profit motives and an appetite for divination and prophecy. Today, new strains of techno-colonialism are emerging, which are the latest of a series of echoes throughout Western history. An ascendant cabal of elites are attempting to reshape the world in their favor, whilst hiding in plain sight behind the faceless technologies that have enriched them. Theirs is a Promethean zealotry without faith, affecting an aura of divine sanction for the purposes of elevating the ego, enriching the chosen ones, and creating empires of various stripes. But was it not always so? So there's this, I'll skip that. There's this desire that we see time and again in human history, but I think more than ever in the present, of this desire to secede, to run away, to exit from whatever it is that we're living in, to find some other place. And, the job, profit, in a canonical sense, is to lead the faithful to the promised land. So we've had these ideas of exiting whatever unfortunate situation we might be in the present, in the here and now, and looking for some kind of paradise, some kind of utopia, some kind of answer to all our problems. And of course, there's always, if you have a need and a desire, there's very often somebody that's ready there to sell you a dream, with the emphasis on word sell. So we've had these technologically mediated examples of secessionism, very much driven by libertarian strains of thought on the right, and the technology of cryptocurrencies, the underlying technology, blockchain technology, is also hypothesized to be a way to create technical infrastructure and architecture with which to administer these imaginary countries, these would-be nations. But again, it's nothing new. If we think back to the rush for land in the post-Columbus era of colonizations, one of the most curious things that would happen is just a bunch of like regular guys, there might be from the army or something like that, not nobles, not royals, just kind of regular people, would go off somewhere, find a tribe that's willing to negotiate, and promise them protection from the conquistadors or the colonial hegemons in return for territory and some rights. And then what they would do very often is go back to their home country and say, I am the king of blah, 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 you can buy shares in my country. And so this happens quite a lot. And I would argue that it's also beginning to happen again in the present day. So we have people that are trying to build new kinds of organizations and nation states in the virtual realm. So I just showed you, actually, back here on the top left, Lieberland, which is a small strip of swamp between Serbia and Croatia, and that neither a country can occupy because it would trigger a war based on the conditions of a peace treaty. So some enterprising Bitcoiner showed up and put his flag in it and said, that's my country. And so they can't actually live there because like the police escort them home whenever they try to visit it. That hasn't stopped them commissioning Zaha Hadid architects to make a metaverse city. And they're trying to create legitimacy for their virtual territory before they can make it real, like in the face of the planet that we live on today. And there's been many examples of well-meaning or otherwise crypto projects trying to buy islands, buy cruise ships, and try to make their own, let's say, token-gated paradises, temporary utopias, temporary autonomous zones. We've even now got leaders of nations trying to do it. So El Salvador made Bitcoin legal tender. And the idea is that they want to use the geothermal energy from their volcano, San Salvador volcano, to power the El Salvador Bitcoin City, which exists as a kind of weird golden effigy in the president's or in the prime minister's office in Little Elves. There's been many, more recently, there's been many initiatives trying to build on this kind of secessionary idea, this idea of building new territories, first in cyberspace and then in the real world, such as Aleph, Praxis, and Prospera. And many of them are associated with right-wing ideologues, like Kurt Schaven, who's in the bottom right of the screen. If you don't know who he is, I'm very happy for you. Don't look up who he is if you don't ever read. And so what we've got now is this concept of a network state, this idea that we can build countries using blockchain technology. I just want to read you a little quote from the book that introduced this concept. A network state is a social network with a moral innovation, a sense of national consciousness, a recognized founder, a capacity for collective action, an in-person level of civility, an integrated cryptocurrency, a consensual government limited by a social smart contract, an archipelago of crowd-funded physical territories, a virtual capital, and an on-chain census that provides and proves a large enough population, income, and real estate footprint to attain a measure of diplomatic recognition. Okay. Not going to dissect the statement, just going to roll on. I pulled back to an article I wrote earlier in the year called Profit Motives. We're trying to map out how these intentional communities online might then become territorialized and institutionalized and ultimately legitimate locations on the map. So this is, in many ways, capitalism puncturing holes in the map of the world as we see it today. And it's nothing new. We've had special economic zones, charter cities, weird city-states for a long time. But what's interesting now is that it seems that capital can accelerate this process, or at least that is what is trying to be done now, using like enormous amounts of money that have been made largely on these crypto markets or in other tech industries to try and reshape the global map in the favor of these would-be emperors. So nothing is new under the sun. And I would argue that we saw something a bit like this in medieval history. Maybe you've heard of the Crusades. And I'll read you a little bit from the book that's coming out next year. Today's tech overlords are the descendants of Europe's crusaders, well-financed, zealous fanatics, wreaking destruction on the planetary other in the name of their greater good. The Vatican-sponsored waves of Levantine invasions that began in the late 11th century were the midwife of capitalism, colonialism, and technology as we know it today. With the network state organizational concept, a cadre of powerful ideologues blessed with tokenized wealth are toying with the prospect of reshaping national frontiers, mirroring the desires of Frankish noblemen and their knightly orders in the Levant 1,000 years ago. Right, and so we're going to go through. Crusades were very long, very messy and horrible. We all know that. I'm going to focus on one particular part of it because of where we are. Normally I talk about the First Crusade because that was the mission accomplished moment for the West. They showed up, they conquered Jerusalem, and they created a series of Crusader kingdoms in the Levant. Take a look at the map of the Crusader kingdoms. Does that look like a country that exists today? Interesting questions. And so they created these states at the end of the 11th century, and you spent the next century trying to keep them. By the beginning of the 13th century, they'd lost them. The warring tribes of the Levant united under an Arabized Kurd, Saladin, and they retook the land. And then the Second and Third Crusade were more of a stalemate and negotiation to give Christians access to the sites of the Holy Land. And so what I want to talk about today, let's quickly do this. This is probably the spiciest slide in the talk. This is new. So the idea of the Crusade, this idea of a holy war, wars of the cross. I think this idea has basically existed since the birth of Islam. And, when Islam was minted, there was a great deal of territorial conquest radiating out from the epicenter of where that was founded. And you could argue that the Crusades were, in many ways, a reaction to that. But this notion of the Crusade, interestingly, probably didn't exist at the time. Like, you could argue that by the time the action was over, by the end of the 13th century, there wasn't really, these things weren't clear Crusades back then. This was a post hoc rationalization concept which has been applied back to it. But it's interesting that this concept has stuck with us to the present day. So Dwight Eisenhower, who led the US military efforts in World War II, called D-Day Crusade in Europe. George W. Bush, many people's favorites, politicians I'm sure, called the Iraq War, or the post-9/11 misadventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, a crusade. The war on terrorism was a crusade to George W. Bush. Osama bin Laden called for a jihad against Jews and Crusaders, even before 9/11, 98. And most recently, Erdogan has made a statement as to this current situation in the Levant, accusing the West of wanting to start another Crescent Crusader conflict. So that is no small amount of, controversial talk. The thing I really want to talk about for the last few minutes is the Fourth Crusade, because it happened here, or at least part of it happened here. So this is 1202 to 1204. At this point, the Crusaders have lost the Holy Land, and they're based between Cyprus and Italy, and their respective kingdoms in the European Christendom. So the idea was to sail from Venice and Marseille to Alexandria and strike at one of the major centers of the Ayyubid dynasty of Saladin in Alexandria in Egypt. So the idea was that the Knights Templar, the Pope was no longer funding the Crusades, so the Crusader organizations had to find the money for themselves. So the Pope did an exit to community on the Crusaders, which I think is very interesting. So the idea was that the Knights would fund this themselves. They would arrive, take the cross for honor, arrive in Venice, and then crowdfund the cost of the ship that the Venetians were building. Unfortunately, not enough knights showed up. So the Crusaders owed the Venetians a lot of money and essentially entered the service of the Venetians as mercenaries. And the Venetians didn't really have much of an ideological bent, I would say. They were mostly like merchant capitalists. So they had a beef with Zadar, or Zara as it was then, in Dalmatia, what's now Croatia. And that was one of their big rivals in the time. So the idea was that they wanted to attack Zadar. And when the fleet arrived there, the locals painted crosses on their windows to remind the army that was arriving that not only were they Christians, they were also Crusaders. That didn't stop them sacking this town and taking it over in the name of Venice. And then there was another side quest. Due to this monetary shortfall, there was maybe some of you know this better than I do, I'm no medieval historian, there was a disagreement over succession in the Byzantine Empire at that time, and there was a king was killed and his brother assumed the throne, and the son of the usurped king attempted to regain the throne. So there was this, I'm sure it happened a lot back then, disagreements over the succession. And so the son of the original king paid off the Crusaders, or promised the Crusaders a great deal of money if they would help him recover the throne. And so the Crusaders and the Venetians arrived in Constantinople in 1203, and they sacked the city. They besieged it and sacked it and burnt, I think, a sixth of it down. You probably know about this if you live here. But I think it's very interesting because this was the seat of the Byzantine Empire. This is like the epicenter of the Eastern Christian Empire. So this was like, these were Orthodox Christians, the post-schism at this point, and this is Latin Christians arriving. So this is Christians killing Christians, and the Muslims everywhere else just kind of, I guess, shrugging their shoulders and avoiding it. So I think there's an interesting lesson there about the corruptions of incentives and ideals that capitalism might engender. And so that's the map of what they did. So first they went to first they went to Zadar on the Croatian coast, and then they went to Constantinople. And the idea is that the Turks were convinced, the Greeks were convinced that even the Turks, had they taken the city, would not have been as cruel as the Latin Christians. The defeat of Byzantium already in a state of decline, accelerated the political degeneration so that the Byzantines eventually became easy prey to the Turks. The Fourth Crusade and the crusading movement generally thus resulted ultimately in the victory of Islam, a result which was of course the exact opposite of its original intention. So some people argue that the Fourth Crusade was actually a psyop. I haven't got to the bottom of that, but it's interesting to see that there's medieval conspiracy theories as well as contemporary ones. Has anyone seen the film Kingdom of Heaven? The Ridley Scott epic? Well worth a rewatch at these times, I would say. I've given Jerusalem my whole life. First I thought we were fighting for God. Then I realized we were fighting for wealth and land. I was ashamed. I think I'll wrap it there. Yeah, I'll wrap it there.
Thank you, Wassim.